Hey everyone, you are watching Multipolarista. This is the new media outlet that I launched, and I'm very happy for the first stream that I've done under this name, to have a good friend of the show, amazing journalist, a friend I very much admire, Rania Khalek. Rania, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks, Ben. I'm so happy to be on with you. How are you?
I've been great. Working a lot, getting this off the ground. But for those who don't know it yet, Moderate Rebels, the show that I used to do, has ended. But in the place of Moderate Rebels, I'm continuing to do these podcasts at least once a week. This is actually the second this week. And for this episode, I really wanted to have Rania on because Rania just took multiple trips I mean, each trip deserves its own episode, so we're going to try to fit them both in today. But Rania, with the team at Breakthrough News, an amazing journalistic team, including Eugene Puryear, Will Whiteman, and others, they just took a trip to Ethiopia and Eritrea. And there's so much to talk about there. These are countries that are targeted now by US sanctions. These are countries that have been resisting a war in which foreign meddling has played an important role in the war that they've been waging against this group, the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, which, there's a lot of evidence suggesting that the TPLF has been supported by the United States and European powers. We're going to talk about that in a second. But Rania also just got back a few days ago from Cuba, a country that has been targeted by Washington for decades. Ever since the 1959 revolution, Cuba has been targeted for regime change, coup attempts, a failed invasion with Bay of Pigs. And then for over 60 years now, Cuba has been under this suffocating economic blockade that is illegal every single year for 29 years. The entire international community, the actual international community, which, by the way, doesn't just mean all the white countries, the actual international community every year votes to condemn the U.S. blockade on Cuba. Well, Rania just took a trip there. And as we talk about it, I'm going to show photos of her trip that she tweeted out. So, Rania, let's start with Cuba, and then I want to talk about Ethiopia and Eritrea as well. But because it's more fresh in your mind, can you talk about your trip to Cuba and how your experience was there?
Yeah, I felt really privileged to be able to go to Cuba because since Trump took office, he basically undid all of the normalization efforts of the Obama administration. And so now Americans can't visit Cuba as tourists anymore. You have to go under a certain condition. There's journalism, there's humanitarian aid, and there's doing religious work, of course, because the US is so obsessed with proselytizing right-wing Christianity across Latin America. So we went, we got a journalist visas. We've been trying to go on this trip for quite some time, in fact, but the pandemic kind of put it on hold because Cuba took COVID very seriously and wasn't allowing people to visit for a while. So I felt really lucky to get to go. I've never been to Cuba, of course, as a leftist. It's always been a place I wanted to go. And it was a little bit of a contradictory feeling on a lot of levels because it's an amazing country with a really incredible and inspiring system that is, I would say, so much more democratic than the system that we have in the US, which I know is contrary to the way that the media portrays Cuba as some sort of dictatorship and police state. It wasn't a police state or dictatorship feeling there at all. And I've been in police states and dictatorships, and I know what that's like.
Yeah,
This was
like the United States, you mean?
Yeah. I mean, if we're talking about police states, there's nothing that compares to the US on 5 different levels. I think I saw one cop car while I was there, drive by a traffic cop car, and that's it. We walked around with a camera and no handlers all around Havana, and no one once asked us for our credentials. We just went around talking to people on camera, and we weren't stopped and asked for our credentials. And people were very open about their political opinions on camera. Nobody was scared to talk. People were very willing to be critical of the government, in fact, just not in the way maybe the American government wants. The American wants capitalist opposition in Cuba. What you have in Cuba is some frustration with the situation there, but much of the criticism is actually from a left perspective. And maybe a different, a different view of how maybe the government should be handling this difficulty or that challenge. But but it was a really open place, a really warm culture, a really inviting place. The contradiction, of course, was, and I wouldn't call it a contradiction, more of like the feeling there was, it was really sad because people are dealing with a lot of difficulties because of the blockade. And of course, Cuba's been under blockade, as you mentioned, for 60 years. And that's in combination with all kinds of US schemes to undermine the socialist revolution in that country. Whether it's hundreds of assassination attempts, attempted invasions, actual terrorism sponsored by the United States, and so many other ways the US has tried to undermine the Cuban government through, various NGOs and NGO money and using the internet and on and on and on and on. But because under Trump, he came in and his administration attacked Cuba's main sources of income through the tourism industry is a main source of income that was attacked by Trump. I mean, Trump added 243 new sanctions against Cuba, and that is on top of the already very crippling US blockade that makes the economic situation in that country difficult. This made it even worse, and this happened during a pandemic. So in the middle of a pandemic, you have Cuba being cut off from tourism, both because of the pandemic and because of these new sanctions, as well as remittances. Trump made it, I think he limited the amount of remittances that people in the US can send back to their families in Cuba. And, people all over the developing world depend on remittances from their families in the global north who have immigrated. And that's not just Cuba. I mean, that's the case for Lebanon. That's the case for basically all over Africa, all over the Middle East, all over Latin America. So that's a huge source of income that people depend on that they were cut off from because of Trump. And then there's the medical brigades. Cuba has this incredible medical system that's socialist. Medical care is free. And it's all revolves around preventative care in a really holistic way where you have layers of medical care from your local neighborhood doctor whose house you can go to for easy visits, who goes and actually checks on disabled and elderly people in the neighborhood to make sure their vitals are good, their blood pressure is good, they're getting what they need, to neighborhood clinics, to bigger hospitals that they'll send you to if the neighborhood clinic can't help you, and then various specialties they'll send you to if you need real serious care for a really serious problem. And so their medical system inside the country is incredible because it exists across the country, even in the countryside, which was a huge accomplishment of the revolution in Cuba. But more than that, Cuba has these international medical brigades that they send their doctors to provide basically free medical care to areas around the world, particularly the developing world. And they'll serve, in very poor areas of Brazil and Venezuela and Bolivia and various countries in Africa in order to provide care to people who otherwise don't have access to medical care. Maybe there's no clinic in their town, right? And so Trump, when he took office, he had, John Bolton and Marco Rubio in charge of these policies to try to strangle these leftist Latin American governments. They basically pressured various governments to kick out, to deport the Cuban doctors. And that's what happened with Bolsonaro in Brazil. One of the first things he did was he deported the medical brigades, essentially taking away access to medical care for his own people, but also governments like Brazil that have money. What they would do is they would pay a stipend to the doctors, as well as a portion of that money would go to the Cuban government. So that was the purpose of kicking out those medical brigades. And then as soon as there was the coup in Bolivia, you remember when Janine Áñez took over, one of the first things that she did at the behest of the US government, and I'm sure, her own volition because she's a fascist, was to kick out the Cuban doctors in Brazil, accusing them of being spies. And
sorry to cut you off, Rania, really quickly, but also what's funny, I mean, it's really sad, but what's sadistically funny in Brazil is that after Bolsonaro kicked out all of those Cuban doctors, during the pandemic, there were so many rural areas in Brazil without Cuban doctors, so they desperately requested them to send back the doctors that he had expelled.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, you can, this is US government policy. Mike Pompeo applauded that, by the way, applauded Bolivia and Brazil for kicking out the Cuban doctors, because what the US does is it has Cuba on the human trafficking list because they claim that these Cuban doctors are slaves, that the Cuban government is forcing to work around the world for free so that the Cuban government can make their money from off of the doctors' free labor, which isn't even true. The doctors actually make more money abroad than they do inside Cuba. So it was, it's just such a ridiculous accusation. But actually, part of the reason for that accusation is also to pressure governments that use this medical care to push out those doctors, because it kind of subjects them to potential punishment as well for participating in so-called human trafficking. But anyways, it's, that's another huge source of income that's been taken away from the Cubans. And this is all in the middle of a pandemic that the Cubans took very seriously. And they took it so seriously. Cuba has the other amazing thing I got to see in Cuba is I got to visit the vaccine production facilities. I got to speak to the heads of the Cuban Vaccine Task Force, as well as the head of the Finley Institute in Cuba that was responsible for developing the Sobanera vaccine. I think I'm saying that right. I always say that word wrong, but I think I said it right, which means sovereignty, actually, which I think is really cool. And this is one of Cuba's most effective vaccines. Cuba managed to develop 5 vaccines against COVID. I think 3 of them have like 90% or higher efficacy rate. So they're like as good as Pfizer and Moderna. And the reason Cuba was able to do this, yep, there's the photo of me and Vincente, Dr. Vincente at the Finley Institute. And I look forward to that interview coming out. But, one of the most amazing things is that under this blockade, Cuba managed to develop like this world-renowned biomedical industry. They are one of the leaders in biomedical technology, and that includes vaccines. So despite the blockade, and this is something that Cuba invested in under Fidel Castro starting in the 80s for the purposes of like sovereignty and also trying to do something good in the world. And, Fidel Castro says that like science is what makes us like, a free nation, basically. And like education makes us a free nation. So they have these like, despite the blockade, despite the delays in receiving equipment, they are leaders in this. And so they were able to develop these vaccines, but the vaccines were somewhat delayed in production for months because the blockade delays everything. Because when you have a country under sanctions as strict and severe as Cuba, I forgot to remind people that under Trump, Cuba was also placed on the state sponsor of terrorism list. So when all of these labels are attached to you, even if they're unilateral by the US government, I'm sure people who follow your content, Ben, are aware of this. But when the US does this to a country, it basically makes financial institutions that are mostly based in the West and banks and other companies and businesses very reluctant to sell to these countries or do business with these countries because they'll face such huge financial penalties if they accidentally violate this like crazy maze of US sanctions from the Treasury Department, which requires like a team of lawyers to make sure you don't violate them. So as a result, everything is delayed. Like a lot of companies that sell medical equipment from Europe, for example, will have to do like a really meticulous audit before they sell to Cuba to make sure they're not violating sanctions. So there was like a 3-month delay in the vaccine development process in Cuba, and people didn't have to die, but died from COVID as a result. Because had they had that vaccine, even if they had gotten COVID, would have been able to stay out of the hospital. Because as we know, these vaccines prevent hospitalization like almost like 99.9% of the time. So it's just really vicious what the US has done to Cuba, but it's also incredibly inspiring to see how I think one of the reasons they've survived, and a lot of Cubans will say this, is because they have a socialist system that places people over profit, makes sure people don't starve, makes sure people have access to preventative medical care. One thing I'll add before you maybe have another question is, I visited pharmacies, and what I was told in pharmacies, a lot of the shelves are empty. And the reason for that is because of the new restrictions under Trump. And by the way, Biden added even more sanctions after campaigning on reversing Trump's restrictions on Cuba. He actually added even more sanctions after the like mostly AstroTurf July 11th protest that happened last year, that were heavily encouraged by the US and were actually a result of the shortages that were making people really frustrated. But at the pharmacies, the pharmacists told me one after another is that they used to, like before Trump came to office, they would get 100% of the medicines that they ordered. But since Trump instituted those 243 sanctions, they're only about to fill 27% of the orders they need. So you can imagine what that means. That means people don't have access to like basic medicines like Tylenol and Motrin. So like even just a basic over-the-counter anti-inflammatory is not available at most Cuban pharmacies. And you know, we went to Cuba for this journalistic reporting trip. The way we got there was we tagged along with, as a part of the reporting that we're doing, we tagged along with a bunch of activist groups, the people, or the People's Forum, Code Pink, and another group whose name I'm blanking on. I'm sorry about that, but they're like a Cuban American group based in Miami who's against the blockade, and I'm sorry to them for blanking on their name. But these groups organized a humanitarian aid mission where they basically raised money to get a charter plane, fill it with 15,000 pounds of milk powder for baby formula to take to Cuba to help their pediatric wards get through the next couple months because they don't have baby formula in Cuba right now because of the blockade. And that's how we came in. And it was just really devastating that this country that has accomplished so much and has this incredible, socialist model that really, presents a model for, I think, a lot of the region, is being strangled by the US government. And of course, that's why they're being strangled. They're being strangled so that their socialist model fails.
Absolutely. And there's so much to say there. I mean, your analysis was excellent. I mean, thanks for sharing that. The first thing I'll say is just that here I have this photo up of the activists from Code Pink and other groups delivering the powdered milk that they can't deliver because of the sanctions. And here are some other photos.
Another Plaintiffs de Amor. Sorry, Plaintiffs de Amor is the name of the group. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Which means bridges of love. And another thing I wanted to point out is that Code Pink very much deserves credit for is because of the illegal, again, we need to stress, this illegal blockade imposed by the United States for over 60 years now. There's also been a shortage of syringes that they need for, obviously, vaccination. And Code Pink, I know, organized a campaign. Here's an article that was actually in Telesur, and it's Cuba is grateful for the syringes that were sent by the people of the United States. And here you can see Medea Benjamin and the team from Code Pink sending syringes to Cuba. So, I mean, it's amazing to see the solidarity from groups like Code Pink and other anti-war activists, anti-imperialists in the United States. Something that you mentioned I think is so important is the fact that this small country, Cuba, that has been blockaded illegally for 60 years. And again, when we're talking about Cuba, we have to compare it to its other neighbors, not to rich imperialist countries, because we often hear apples and oranges being compared, right? We hear Cuba compared to Florida, even though Florida is, in the United States, the richest country on earth that got its wealth through imperial plunder and genocide of Native Americans and slavery. Cuba is a country that has only been able to develop through a process of socialism under siege. So we have to compare Cuba not to the United States, but compare it to the Dominican Republic and compare Cuba to Haiti, countries that, not because of the faults of their peoples who have tried to struggle, but countries that have horrible rates of poverty and violence and infant mortality. Meanwhile, in Cuba, the life expectancy is higher than the United States. And the infant mortality rate in Cuba is lower than in the United States. Those are according to World Bank statistics. So given all of that, I mean, it's incredible. And then you mentioned the fact that Cuba, this small country under a blockade, has been able to create not one, but multiple, 5 different COVID vaccines. Here in Nicaragua, a lot of people have been vaccinated with the Abdala and Soberana, which is the sovereign vaccine, Soberana, but also the Abdala. And I know, including not just adults, but children in Nicaragua, young people and children have been vaccinated with these Cuban vaccines. And of course, the World Health Organization hasn't approved it because the World Health Organization, unfortunately, is dominated by a lot of these Western governments. But Cuba and China and Russia have created these extremely effective vaccines. And here in Nicaragua, you have all of them. You have the Cuban, the Russian, and the Chinese vaccines. I know people who have gotten all these vaccines. But what's incredible is that China is the largest country in terms of population on the planet, which has now the largest economy. By the way, it surpassed the United States, according to McKinsey. Russia is another massive country. So those are two superpowers. It's not surprising to hear that they both have very good, effective vaccines. But Cuba is a small island nation under blockade and has 5. So, I mean, I just wanted to say how incredible it was. I mean, you already spoke a bit about that. Can you also talk about your experience seeing the health program? Because you talked about, for instance, you visited this school where Cuba trains doctors, and not only trains Cuban doctors, and of course, Cuba exports doctors around the world. Cuba has sent thousands and thousands of doctors to over 100 countries. But also, you discussed in your tweet, which I'll get up in a second, you talked about how Cuba trains doctors in other countries, including people in the United States who are from poor working class communities, like in the Bronx and other parts of the United States, and they're trained to be doctors, and then they go back to their country.
Yeah, this was really incredible. So we visited the, excuse me, the Latin American Medical School, where people from 92 countries go to medical school for free, including obviously Cubans. But what was really incredible about this is most of these people that go to this school from other countries are from like developing countries. And the idea is they're trained in Cuba so they can take what they learn back to their home countries, and they go for free. So they're not going to be saddled by debt, and they can like go serve in these underprivileged areas. But there's also doctors who come from the US. And that's what this photo is. These are a few of the doctors that we interviewed, or a few of the medical students that we interviewed. One of them was from the Bronx, but grew up in Ghana. Another one was from Chicago. Another one was from Philly. Another from Missouri. And they, you know, it was really amazing. They all came to medical school in Cuba because they were really inspired by Cuba's system, for one, because it's so focused on preventative care, which is like the opposite of what we do in the US. In the US, it's all about you wait till you get sick to go to the doctor, and then it costs a lot of money. So sometimes you even wait longer so that you don't have to like go bankrupt in case you're really sick. So you wait almost till it's an emergency, because in the US, we punish people with huge medical bills for getting sick. In fact, I'll just say this, you know, my health insurance premium just went up. And I was like, I had to ask, I was like, why did my premium go up? I like emailed my health insurance. It's actually like, it's an American provider, but it's an international health insurance because I don't live in the US. So I emailed them and I'm like, why did my premium go up? And they got back to me. They were like, because you've entered a new age bracket, because I'm now 35. So they also punish you in the US for like getting older. Like it's so insane. It's so insane. And like, so these people were inspired to go to Cuba because they don't have a for-profit medical system. And they were really attracted to it by the way their medical system is run. And then also they'll come out debt-free. So they can actually like, you know, not have to go into like a field necessarily or specialty in medicine that makes so much money to pay off these exorbitant medical school debt, but they can go back to their communities and serve in like underprivileged areas that they are from themselves without having to worry about making a ton of money. And so that was really cool too. I'll also mention, you know, we also visited one of these like clinics these public clinics in the outskirts of Havana, which is like a very kind of everywhere in Cuba is kind of a working class area, but there's a few areas that look like a little poorer and so we went to an area that looked, you know, a little poorer than maybe the center of Havana. And they have access to this public clinic. There's like all the machines they need. Of course, there's a lot of shortages because of the blockade, which people told us about. But the doctors there, almost all of them had served in the international medical brigades at some point. They'd been to like Venezuela or Bolivia. But they had the coolest system. It was like this layered system where, like I mentioned, if in your neighborhood you have a doctor whose house you can go to, you like can go to their home. They have like an area in their home in the neighborhood where you can go, and if you have any ailments, go just have a checkup, whatever. And if they can't help you, they'll send you to the clinic, which isn't too far away, the neighborhood clinic, which looks a lot like an urgent care kind of sort of place, right? Like to compare it to the US. And if they can't help you there, then you go to the hospital. And if they can't help you there, then they send you to like whatever specialty you need to go to. And I thought this was so cool because it was all so focused on prevention, which is actually cheaper. It's cheaper to provide preventative care because you end up preventing all the horrible emergency and chronic conditions that we have in the US that, cause so much medical debt and early death for people in America. And that's why, despite the blockade and the medicine shortages that Cuba's had to deal with for its entire existence in many ways, you have like mortality in the rate in the US. You have like, people are living in Cuba almost to the same age that they are in the US, which is the richest country in the world. It's because of this preventative holistic model they have. And I'll add one more thing related to the vaccines that I thought was really interesting because, to get to Cuba, we first went to Miami. We flew from Miami. So we spent a day in Florida, in Miami, which is like right-wing Cuba. That's where a lot of like the right-wing Cuban exile community is based, as well as the right-wing Venezuelan community. Not all of them. I know there's people there who don't agree with that, but the loudest people who really dominate the politics of that city are very right-wing, very anti-socialist, anti-Cuban revolution. And just the juxtaposition between the attitude and the culture that we saw in Miami versus Havana was so different. In these places, it's an hour flight. Like, it's not far. They're 90 miles apart, right? And there was no one wearing masks anywhere, even inside in Florida, in Miami. And we know Florida doesn't have a high vaccination rate. There's a very, very anti-vaccine, anti-public health attitude. In Cuba, without a vaccine mandate of any sort, they have managed to vaccinate 90% of their population, including children 2 and up, because the Sobanera vaccine was actually created almost geared towards children in particular. So, and it's very safe for children. And so 90%, like, how did Cuba reach 90% vaccination rate? And they wear masks everywhere in Cuba. And I think I'm so American. I was a little like, this is too much mask wearing because I'm like so American. And it's just like, we don't have to wear them almost anywhere in America, that I've gotten used to that. But in Cuba, they take it really seriously because for them, like, I think almost like between 8,000 to 9,000 people died from COVID in Cuba in the last 2 years. And for them, that number is way too high. Like, that number is so high, like, and people who didn't even feel it, like people who just know that people died of COVID in Cuba were so bothered by that. There's a sense of collective responsibility there that even if someone who isn't your family member, who's a stranger, is dying from a virus and you can do something to prevent the spread of it, people feel very strongly about protecting each other. And they also, because the Cuban medical system is so superior to so many medical systems around the world, but because they have a history of going to the doctor, of knowing their doctor, of being taken care of by their doctor, of not being put into debt by their doctor, there's a high level of trust in public health in Cuba. So that's why it wasn't necessary to have a vaccine mandate to force people to get vaccinated, because people did it willingly after, an educational campaign by the government that they trust. Even people who are anti-revolution in Cuba have a certain kind of faith in the public healthcare system because it treats them well. Unlike the US, where I think one of the biggest obstacles to people getting vaccinated is, one, nothing in the US is free. So I think there's a lot of people who are like, why the hell is this free? Something must be wrong with it. So I think that actually has maybe played somewhat of a role in vaccine hesitancy in the US, but also on a bigger, like on another big scale kind of level, in the US, we have a public health system that we feel like we can't trust because it like terrorizes us financially. It costs so much money, and we've had so little interaction with doctors, or we've had like 12 different doctors or more throughout our life because you don't go to the same doctor that you went to as a kid, until you're older. You don't have that sort of relationship with medical care in the US. Everything is about, the first thing you do is give them your ID and your insurance card. And can you afford it? And so I think that is such a huge difference to the point of that we have a lot to learn from Cuba. And I'll end with this on this topic is that picture you showed with Dr. Vincente Bencomo of the Finley Institute, who helped develop the Sobanera vaccine. I actually asked him to comment in an interview that'll be coming out in the coming weeks. I asked him to comment on the vaccine hesitancy and the anti-vax sentiment that we're seeing in a lot of the global north. and some in the global South, but I think it's like the level of in the global North is a lot higher, from what I can tell. But, and I asked him specifically about the US. There's people in the US who, consider themselves on the left, and they rightly don't trust big pharma because big pharma has been very abusive. Everything's about profit. And so the vaccines we have in the US are Moderna and Pfizer, which come from big pharma. And so there is this hesitancy, or has been this hesitancy on the left, to not trust these vaccines in particular because of who's making them. So I asked him to comment on that because a lot of, I think that a lot of the people on the left in the US would be interested to hear from a Cuban vaccine developer who isn't in the pockets of big pharma. And his response was really interesting. He was like, look, obviously, I think the Cuban vaccines are better because, we helped develop them. But as far as I've seen, these vaccines from Moderna and Pfizer are very effective. And there's a cost benefit analysis you do. COVID is way riskier than getting this vaccine, which can protect you from going to the hospital and dying. And it's a no-brainer. You get this vaccine. If that's the vaccine available to you, you absolutely get it. And then he went on to compare people who are anti-vax, especially in relation to this vaccine, which we know we have overwhelming evidence is very effective and is very safe. Probably one of the most tested vaccines in history because of the amount of people who've taken it. And he said, look, there's still people who believe the earth is flat today. Like, you're always going to have those people. He basically compared them to flat earthers. But, his thing was like, please get vaccinated. And so I think that was really interesting to hear from a Cuban doctor, a Cuban vaccine producer and developer who obviously is not in the pocket of big pharma. If he was in the US, he would get Pfizer or Moderna or whatever was available to him.
Yeah, I mean, this is the same thing that you hear from scientists and medical professionals in every country targeted by the US for regime change, including China, Vietnam, Cuba. I mean, you can go down the list here in Nicaragua, Venezuela. Like, there are doctors, by the way, and they're not in the pockets of big pharma, obviously. And they're all saying the same thing. And you said something so important about the public health system in Cuba being preventative. And I think this is one of the key reasons that the death toll is so astronomically high in the US because of COVID. And we've seen people, including people on the left, which is really distressing, try to rationalize and downplay these deaths by saying, well, a majority or many of the deaths, we don't know if it's a majority, but many of the deaths in the US of people who had COVID had comorbidities, which is essentially, it's a kind of eugenicist argument, saying that if you have high blood pressure, if you're obese, if you have diabetes, if you have other health issues, if you're old, you basically just deserve to die. Like, I mean, that's an insane argument, an extremely reactionary, fascistic argument. And we hear people saying that it's fascistic to demand public health measures, but actually it's fascistic to say that people who have bad health conditions in an unhealthy society with an unhealthy system that doesn't give them health care deserve to die. And the US doesn't have a preventative healthcare system because it's more profitable, yes, for big pharma to not treat people beforehand, instead to treat them after the hand and to keep them unhealthy. And that's why I think nearly 900,000, over 875,000 people in the United States have died. We're nearing 1 million.
That's probably an underestimate too, right? Yeah.
Yes. And the Biden administration, not only not doing anything, the Biden administration has now announced that as of February 2nd, hospitals don't even have to report COVID deaths, probably because they don't want to actually reach the 1 million number. Because
Ben, I think that everything you're saying speaks to the fact that, like I was saying, how in Cuba, 8,000 deaths is like one death is too many from COVID for them because they really care about human life. And 8,000 deaths is like that. I mean, they like feel traumatized by that. Whereas in the US, like 2,000 or 3,000 deaths in a day has just become background noise. It's normal. And it speaks to how much sickness and death in particular in the US we've been conditioned to put up with. Not just from COVID, but like people making these arguments about, oh, but what about the number of people who are dying from like this disease or this disease? Yeah, what about them? Why aren't we doing anything about that too? The argument shouldn't be, why do we care about COVID? Look how many people are dying of this. It should be, these are all preventable deaths. Like there are millions of preventable deaths in the US that we don't do anything about because we just don't care because we have a for-profit system. And I don't mean we as Americans. I mean the people in charge, the ruling class in the US. does not care. So millions of people in the US needlessly die from all kinds of preventable diseases, not to speak to the unhealthy like lifestyles that we have in the US because of capitalism, the unhealthy eating habits that we have in the US because of capitalism, where trash, garbage, fast food is cheaper and more accessible than fresh groceries. People don't even have access to grocery stores. I mean, we have all these preventable deaths in the US that we're seeing manifest in a higher COVID death rate for certain people in the country geographically that is completely linked to their income level because of capitalism. And that's the conversation that we should be having, not this weird, like eugenicist crap where we're just going to say the 100 million Americans who suffer from comorbidities. And I don't even know if that number is accurate. It might be higher, but it's at least 100 million that suffer from serious comorbidities, that we should just be okay with them dying from COVID. No, I'm not okay with that. And if there's a way to prevent that, we should be doing it. And the Biden administration, for all those people who are out there talking about restrictions and lockdowns and authoritarianism, what lockdowns are you talking about? Like, what restrictions are you talking about? I don't even understand. Like, I look around this country. I travel a lot. Last year, I went to so many countries, I lost count. I went all across Europe. I got to go to Africa, to the Horn of Africa. I got to go to Cuba. I live in Lebanon. And these countries that even don't have that many restrictions, like when I tell Lebanon doesn't have that many restrictions, there's still a higher level of protection there than what you're getting in the US from COVID, which under both administrations of Trump and Biden has had a policy of just let it rip. And both administrations had a policy of vaccines can fix this, because Biden just went along with the vaccine program that Trump actually initiated. And we know that vaccines alone can't fix this, and nothing else was done to fix it, because it was all about get back to work, let it rip, screw the working class, and that's it. That's it. And like, that's what we've decided to do in the US. So I really, I don't know what it is people are talking about. I've traveled into the US. It's the only country where when I travel here, like, I'm not asked anything at customs about my health status, whether I had COVID, whatever. I mean, it wasn't even until recent months that they even started, demanding or checking your vaccine card to enter the US. And you don't even have to do it domestically. So I don't know what the hell people are talking about.
And by the way, that card in the US is a piece of paper.
Yeah.
And I've seen online people are like, anti-vaxxers are selling people that card. You can just write your name on it. Like,
you can also just write your vaccine doses on it. Like, I could write in any 5 doses.
The idea that it's some authoritarian measure, it's a paper card that anti-vaxxers are selling because they've just stolen them from CVS and then just sold them and write people's name. I mean, it's
a cardboard flimsy card. Like, it's just, it's so shocking to me. Like, when I come to the US and everyone's complaining, I'm like, what are you complaining about? Like, what? I mean, the one thing that I will say that I know is really frustrating for a lot of people in America is the situation with schools. But that's not the fault of teachers. That is the fault of a country that said, we don't give a shit. We don't care how much COVID spreads. Let it rip. That's what's happened. And it's caused a disaster in schools because there's staffing shortages, people who have it or maybe have been exposed, have to quarantine, and on and on and on. That would not have to happen had our government done something to prevent the spread of this virus. But instead, they did a weird lockdown for a couple of months that wasn't really a lockdown, so it still spread everywhere. And they didn't really offer people that much help, so they were forced to go to work anyway. And as a result, a lot of small businesses suffered, which caused a lot of reactionary tendencies among small business owners who already have those tendencies anyways. But and obviously corporations took advantage and made as big a profit as they could, which happens under capitalism all the time, especially if there's any sort of disaster. So that's not surprising. But overall, it's as if no one cared. Everyone has it all the time, it seems like. And now the liberals in the Biden administration are trying, because of the change in party power, are trying to downplay it. It's not a big deal. We have to learn to live with it. Omicron is mild, even though we're still having 2,000 deaths a day. It's just complete insanity. And at the end of the day, what people, especially on the left, need to recognize is that What is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism is attacking and weakening the state, right? It's attacking and weakening the state so that you can embolden private enterprise to make more money off of the state, to take away welfare, take away anything, any measure of like good public good that the state does.
Well, yeah, it's attacking the good elements of the state that actually help people while strengthening the repressive apparatus of the state on behalf of capital. That's what neoliberalism does.
And that
police, which act on behalf of capital, police, the military, the repressive apparatus, the mass incarceration, the judicial system, all get more funding because they're repressing poor people. But then anything that could help people, like education and housing programs and jobs programs, and especially healthcare, is all whittled away.
We don't have money for that. Exactly. And that is what has happened with these arguments that are, a lot of which are coming from like the right and increasingly, of course, from the center and from the Democrats. These arguments against state intervention in COVID are actually neoliberal arguments. It's an attack on the parts of the state that we actually need to like help with public health. All of that. So I want to like, I don't know if that makes sense, but like that needs to be repeated over and over again. Because I think I understand the tendency to feel like everything's authoritarian and the state is always bad, but that's actually a very anarchist and libertarian argument. And that isn't actually the left argument. Like traditionally, the left believes in a strong central state apparatus, particularly with respect to the welfare of the public. And this is the moment. This isn't the war on terror. The war on COVID is not the war on terror. I've heard that comparison made. It's not the war on terror. Like the war on COVID is supposed to be a war again, or an attempt to intervene so that a virus doesn't spread. And if we look at the countries that have successfully dealt with this virus, they are leftist countries for the most part. We're talking, I mean, not all of them. There are some capitalist countries that did put in public health measures that maybe even also were a little too extreme in what they did, but they did prevent a lot of deaths. But the example of China, I mean, I think we can debate the specific policies, what would work best in the US, but in China, they're living way more normal lives than we are. And the example of Cuba, the example of Vietnam has been able to handle, keeping this virus at bay, and on and on and on. I mean, it's like, are all of these countries in the pockets of big pharma and of the capitalist ruling elites that are trying to like control our lives more? Like, I don't think so.
Yeah, I think that's what's so important about the trip that you all just took to Cuba, because it really does show not only that another model for healthcare and for everything is possible, but it's even possible in a small, impoverished nation that is under a suffocating blockade and has been under a blockade for 60 years. If Cuba can do these things with the few resources it has under a blockade, then with the help of socialism, than any country can, right? So, yeah. I mean, I'm really looking forward to your reporting. Here is a photo of an interview that you did talking about the healthcare system. And I also briefly wanted, because I still want to talk about Ethiopia and Eritrea, but I also briefly wanted to here's another, I wanted to talk about the other interviews you did in Cuba briefly, but this photo I think says so much really quickly about the philosophy of the Cuban healthcare system. This is an image in the Latin American School of Medicine in Havana, and it says, "For a more humane world." And you see the Castros, and behind them this pastiche, this with all these photos. And that, I mean, I think it really describes the philosophy of their health system, for a more humane world. But really briefly, Rania, before we move to Ethiopia and Eritrea, I wonder if you can just briefly summarize. I mean, I'm looking.
This is like a highlight. No, this was a highlight of my. This is like a highlight of my life. Sorry,
this is a photo of you interviewing Che Guevara's daughter, Che Guevara's daughter, Aleida Guevara, and then you also interviewed Camila Guevara. So these are the children of Che Guevara.
I didn't get to interview his son. His son, actually, I just got to meet his son. I just interviewed his daughter, but I had to take a selfie. I was like, please don't judge me, but can I take a selfie with you? But no, Aleida Guevara was Che Guevara's daughter. One of Che Guevara's daughters was like amazing. So she's actually a physician. She's a doctor, and she served abroad in the medical brigade. She served in Angola.
Sorry to cut you off, but Che was as well.
Yes, exactly. Her father was a doctor, and then she kind of like followed in those footsteps. She's a pediatric doctor. She obviously deals with children. She's sort of retired. She still consults for like the local pediatric hospital nearby, but now she spends a lot of time. And we actually did that interview in the Che Guevara Center, where she spends a lot of time. They have like really cool like centers to Che Guevara. And then they have a recent one that was like built and just opened, I think a few months ago, the Fidel Castro Center. That was like a really incredible experience to go to. But anyway, she is a physician who served in the medical brigade. She was in Angola. She spent time in Venezuela, and she told really cool anecdotes about her time in those countries. And actually, when she was talking about Angola, she started crying. And I talked to her about her father. I talked to her about why she became a doctor. And it was also just really cool because, like, I think Che Guevara plays, obviously, he's like this monumental figure in the minds of so many leftists around the world, and not even just leftists. I think, Ben, you can relate to this. Every developing country I've ever been to, regardless of the political orientation, has photos celebrating Che Guevara and Fidel Castro in particular.
Definitely.
And it's because they stood up to the empire.
They're not only symbols of the left. I mean, they are symbols of the left, but they're also symbols specifically of anti-colonialism, which is why around the global South, even people who are not necessarily leftists admire them for being leaders, models of how they can successfully liberate their countries. I mean, national liberation isn't always socialist. It usually is socialist, but there are other forms of national liberation struggles, you know, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Iranian Revolution, and even, you know, in all of these struggles, they look toward other anti-colonialist movements. And in Latin America, I mean, Che and Fidel are titans.
It's the most successful. Like, they were the most successful. The Cuban Revolution is still going, and they up against all odds, you know. And Che especially, Che Guevara was such an internationalist figure. Obviously, Fidel was too, but Che actually went and fought in the Congo, and he went and fought in Bolivia, where he ultimately was killed with the help of the CIA. So, you know, people have so much respect for these figures, but at the same time, they're still human. And so it's cool to get to talk to people who knew them, because it's easy to think of like their victories as having been set in stone or something. But when they were involved in their struggles, it wasn't for sure. Especially with the actual Cuban Revolution and the fighting. Like, you don't know if you're going to win. You're probably going to lose, actually. A lot of those struggles lost, and they've lost in a very devastating way. So it's cool to, you know, I asked her just about like what she remembers about her dad. And I'm really excited for people to see the responses that she gave. She was a very smart woman, committed to the revolution. And I mean, obviously, like, I don't speak Spanish. I took 4 years of it in high school, but it was kind of useless. I understand a few words here and there. So I had to have like somebody kind of translate what she said to me. But I can't wait to actually see the full context of it, because everyone in the room was in tears. Like, not just her, and because she was crying, I started crying, even though like I kind of had an idea of what she was saying, but I didn't know entirely. So I'm really excited to see that interview, because I'm really excited to see the end result of that interview. And I'm really excited to be able to share it with people. That was definitely a highlight of my life. I didn't tweet about it because there was just I was like overwhelmed. I did so many interviews. So get ready for like an avalanche of Cuba content. But I also got to sit down with Che Guevara's personal photographer, who's like in his 80s. And he was really cool. And like, he kind of just like, you know, the reason he joined the revolution was amazing. The reason he became Che's photographer was amazing. He actually like had showed up with his friends to be a part of like the guerrilla movement, the fight. And they didn't have guns. Like, the only way to get guns is to like steal them from police officers at the time, basically, because the revolution didn't have money. So Che tried to send them home, but this guy did have a camera. So he stayed and just started taking pictures of Che and became his personal photographer. And that's why he became his personal photographer. And he took some of the most like important and, you know, basically the pictures that you would recognize of Che were taken by him. So it was really cool to get to talk to him and about his experiences with this revolutionary, because again, at the end of the day, these people are humans. You know, they're a bit superhuman because of what they accomplished, but it's interesting to see like what their personal lives were like and hear about what their personal lives were like and their personalities. So that was a cool experience. But I also interviewed a member of the Henry Reeve Brigades. The Henry Reeve Brigades is a part of the international medical missions, but they're like special. They're kind of like the special operations of the medical missions who are dispatched by the Cuban government to disaster areas. For example, they served in Haiti after the big earthquake that like killed 100,000 people a few years back. They served in Pakistan after like a tsunami, I think it was. And they actually, the reason they were formed is because after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, Fidel Castro offered to send this newly created Henry Reeve Brigade to go serve in New Orleans and provide free medical care. And the Bush administration rejected that offer. And they were like, okay, fine, you don't want it? Cool, but this is a great idea. Let's do this in other countries. So I got to talk to a guy who actually has served around the world, including in Italy. This is the brigade they sent to Italy when COVID started, and Italy was sort of like the ground zero, or I don't know if that's the right word, because I guess Wuhan was the ground zero, but Italy was the next ground zero of like the worst peak in the world. And so he had served there, and it was really great to talk to him because I just straight up asked him, I was like, how do you respond to these American claims that you're a slave? So that was cool. And I can't wait for people to see his responses. We also spoke to journalists. Believe it or not, there are journalists in Cuba who do journalism just like we do in other countries. And so it was really cool to get to talk to they were younger, especially I got to talk to the head editor of like the largest student newspaper in the country. Got to talk to activists, and, you know, I got to talk to such a wide range, and also people on the street. I got to talk to people on the street. So just like regular people, not for a sit down interview, completely unfiltered. So it was a really cool experience. We were there for like a week and a half, and we made the most of it. And I feel like I got a really good, opportunity. And I feel really confident that I got to see a widespread array of Cuban society, including those who are, maybe opposed to the revolution, but still are which is a very small slice, by the way. There are people who are opposed to the government. I wouldn't say everyone's critical of the government, but there are people, of course, who are opposed to it, and they're not like in jail or dead. They openly say they're opposed to it and nothing happens to them. And a lot of that has to do with, the last thing I'll say is, because I know we've been talking about Cuba for a long time, is, I think among younger people, there's a small slice of them who are on Instagram, who are on Facebook, who are on Twitter, and there is a huge apparatus funded and backed by the US, based mostly in Miami, devoted to convincing those young people that there isn't a blockade. The blockade is a lie. And that's actually a talking point. Like, people like that. There are some people, not everyone, but there's a small slice of people who believe the blockade isn't real because of this propaganda. And, even think about us who are anti-imperialists in the US, and think about how much of an impact social media has on, and we always kind of have to be, what's the word I'm thinking of? We kind of have to always be on alert, because social media, the way it works, especially like Instagram, is it shows you people's lives in a really fake way. And it makes you jealous of them because their lives are perfect. They're on perpetual vacation somehow. Everybody on Instagram is on perpetual vacation and always looks perfect. And that's capitalism. That's how capitalism becomes attractive to people, despite the horrific reality of it. So imagine what a challenge that is for the Cuban revolution to deal with, when there's young people who are dealing with shortages in their own country caused by the US blockade. And there's an avalanche of misinformation funded by the US telling them, not only is there no blockade, but look at what you're missing out on in these capitalist countries, where celebrities have so much and average people have so much, and they're just always at the beach. And they have an overabundance of goods. And so, I think that that's going to be a huge challenge for the Cubans moving forward, is figuring out how to deal with, or how to counter that sort of overwhelming amount of misinformation on the platforms that most young people are getting their news from.
Yeah, I mean, this is a problem that exists around the world. And I got to say, I mean, not even in countries with socialist governments. I mean, because it's not only a difference between socialism and capitalism, but this life of rich people in the imperial core and working people in the global south. And, if you have all these rich people in Miami showing on Instagram all the parties they go to and the beaches and the drinks and the clubs and stuff, I mean, that's not accessible even to a lot of people living in Miami who are cleaning houses and, working day to day, paycheck to paycheck. So not imagine what it would be like if you're a working class person in the global south. I mean, the propaganda potential of these weapons. I mean, social media outlets, these big Silicon Valley companies are weapons, and they all are contractors with the US government, including Facebook, including Twitter, including, I mean, Instagram is owned by Facebook. So, I mean, I do want to talk about Ethiopia and Eritrea. So the last thing I'll say before we transition here is I just wanted to point out that the Biden administration, you referenced this, has been even more aggressive on Cuba than Trump. And that's not just my opinion. This is an article that was published in the New York Times. It's called "Biden Ramps Up Pressure on Cuba, Abandoning Obama's Approach." And although I should mention, we shouldn't whitewash Obama, because Obama never actually lifted the blockade. He just lifted some sanctions. But when he normalized, he never lifted the blockade. But anyway, the point is that this New York Times article boasts, they say this boastingly, that, quote, Biden is taking an even harder line on Cuba than Donald Trump.
Crazy.
So the last thing I just want to end this segment here is just say that, I mean, this is bipartisan barbarism. And it's easy to point at Trump and criticize Trump for the horrible policies that he took toward Cuba, the hundreds of sanctions he imposed. But not only has Biden left on those hundreds of illegal sanctions, he's actually expanded them further. So everything that we just talked about in the past hour, I mean, not only are Republicans dedicated to trying to destroy that, but Democrats are too.
No, it's completely insane. And it's also like, I think this also speaks to the fact that, you know, everyone says, oh, Biden's just listening to the Miami lobby. And I think that that's definitely true, that Biden is listening to the Miami lobby. But we also have to understand that Cuba is in the Western Hemisphere, and there is a bipartisan, like, almost demand that Cuba fail. Because if you have a prosperous, successful model of socialism that is that close to the US, that is that close to all these other Latin American countries that we're trying to make sure don't ever go socialist as like the American ruling classes, you have to strangle it. Like, you have to strangle it so that, and that's why Cuba is Cuba isn't just demonized in Cuba, it's demonized to the domestic American audience, so that none of us look too closely at the good attributes of Cuba, because we're just too focused on the bad attributes that the US is mostly lying about. So there's a reason that Cuba in particular is under such relentless attack. And it's one of the main reasons is you cannot, we know the US is terrified of any socialist or communist model anywhere of the world succeeding. And 90 miles away from what's considered US territory is absolutely unacceptable.
Absolutely. It's known as the threat of a good example. The US can never tolerate the threat of a good example.
Exactly.
Well, with that said, let's move to Ethiopia and Eritrea. Rania, we talked about your trip to Cuba that you took with Breakthrough News, but you also, before that, took a trip to not only Ethiopia, but also Eritrea. Both countries deserve an entire episode. We don't have that much time, but I mean, especially Eritrea. No disrespect to Ethiopia, which is an incredible country with an incredible history, but I know people who have been to Ethiopia. I don't know really anyone who has been to Eritrea. I mean, Eritrea, like Cuba, is a country that has suffered for many years under sanctions, under a kind of de facto blockade, and they have been forced to adopt a model of development because they're under siege, right?
Yeah.
A lot of these countries in the global south, you know, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, the DPRK, Syria, these countries that are under siege are forced to develop this new kind of interesting model. So I'm wondering if you can reflect overall on your experience. Here's a photo of you with your colleagues, Eugene Puryear and Will Whiteman from the excellent Breakthrough News team. Talk about what your trip was like to Ethiopia and Eritrea.
So our trips to these two places were very different. Ethiopia was obviously has very much of the country was a war zone when we were there back in December. But we first started in Addis Ababa, which the US was insisting every single day Americans need to leave because there's like a looming war coming to the capital, but it was like totally safe and normal. It's quite a developed city. So we spent some time in the capital city, Addis. There's some of the images you're showing now. I was just kind of showing how normal life is. But there's been this war going on in Ethiopia. I'll just briefly note there's been a war between the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, and the government of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. And just for some quick background, I know you've told your viewers about this before, but for those who don't know, the TPLF was in charge of Ethiopia for almost 3 decades, for almost 30 years. They ruled with an iron fist, and they were really the America's like policing force in the Horn of Africa. In collaboration with the Americans, they actually attacked the Eritreans and stole some of their land and had a war with the Eritreans several times in the 90s. And in the 2000s, I think 2006, they participated in the invasion of Ethiopia, of Somalia, neighboring Somalia, under the so-called banner of the War on Terror, to basically destroy the Islamic State Court, or the Islamic Courts Union, which was like one of the first stable governments to come to power in Somalia after state collapse throughout the 90s, caused mostly by the United States' policies there. That devastated Somalia, and they carried out so many atrocities there. Meanwhile, they, across Ethiopia, they were incredibly anti-democratic. They looted like $30 billion throughout their time in power. Which is really weird that there's some academics who call the TPLF leftist just because they like identified as Marxist in the 1980s when they were fighting the Derg in Ethiopia. Anyways,
and really quickly, not to get in a really long intra-left debate about history and revisionism and all this stuff, but specifically they were like Hojaites, kind of like old like Maoish split-offs that call themselves anti-revisionists, and a lot of those groups that called themselves anti-revisionists ended up blatantly allying with U.S. imperialism openly, because they claimed that the Soviet Union was social imperialist. So they allied with capitalist imperialism against what they called social imperialism. So the TPLF comes out of this tendency of the left that has a long history of openly collaborating with Western imperialism.
So throughout their time, in power, the U.S. like just rained aid down on the TPLF. A lot of it was stolen, and they were kind of allowed to do whatever they wanted in Ethiopia. So people were like tortured, imprisoned, and tortured and exiled, and the U.S. never really cared because the TPLF were sort of like their lapdogs. And then come 2016, there was protests in Ethiopia against the TPLF government. And ultimately that led to the rise of Abiy Ahmed, who actually came out of a coalition that was, out of a TPLF dominated coalition. But ultimately, when he did come to power, democratically, I should say, he pushed the TPLF out of power. And, you're an authoritarian group that's been in charge for almost 30 years. You're not going to go down without a fight. And that's what happened. The TPLF responded to being pushed out of power by, in November of 2020, launching what can only be considered a violent coup attempt against the Ethiopian government. They launched a huge attack on the Ethiopian Northern Command base, and they killed like, nobody knows the real number of how many they killed, but it's supposed to, it's suspected to be in the thousands. That's a huge attack. Like, think about that militarily. Like, there wasn't a moment in Iraq or even overall where American soldiers were killed in the thousands. Imagine if they had been. And it wasn't just soldiers. They attacked nearby villages and like ethnically cleansed them and killed hundreds of civilians. And the Ethiopian government responded by attacking them back. And that is how the war started. The TPLF even openly said they started the war, like on several occasions. But having been in power for so long, they had formed relationships with international media outlets. The Ethiopians who were staffing a lot of the UN positions were dominated by pro-TPLF people. So like they had a propaganda apparatus that went to work right away. Like the day they attacked the Ethiopian government, there was like a hashtag trending of Tigray genocide. And from then on, that was the narrative that the entire Western media apparatus went with, was there's a genocide in Tigray. The Ethiopian government is carrying out a genocide against Tigrayans. And that's the story. When the story was much more complicated than that. This was a group that was angry about being pushed out of power, using ethnicity to get the international community on board with a regime change attempt. And of course, the US was happy to get on board with this because the US wants their lapdogs back in power. And Abiy Ahmed, while he wasn't exactly some socialist revolutionary, he's not socialist at all. He's independent.
Yeah, I mean, we should be clear. I mean, he's a liberal. Like, yeah. He talks about opening up and reforms and all this stuff. he's a liberal, but even he's not a puppet is the issue for the Washington.
Exactly. That's all that matters is he's, getting closer to China. He's pursuing peace with Eritrea. He won a Nobel Peace Prize for making peace with Eritrea, which the US was not happy about because, Eritrea, demonized, sanctioned country, most sanctioned country, I think, in Africa. Maybe Zimbabwe is worse. I'm not quite sure. But the point is, he was doing things independent of the US. He was doing things in Ethiopia's interests as he saw it. And that is always scary for the US. I mean, think about how the US acted with Jamal Abdel Nasser. Like, he wasn't a socialist. He had some social welfare policies, but he wasn't even like a stooge of the Soviets or whatever. He was kind of like he was doing what was best for Egypt, and he became an American enemy for that. And so that's what happens with developing countries. As my colleague Eugene Purrier always says, it's under the imperial order led by the US, every country has a role. And if you don't play that role, you will be attacked. And that's what happened with Ethiopia. And so the reason we went there is we were covering what was happening in Ethiopia, doing a lot of interviews, hosting people who had been there, hosting Ethiopians, hosting Tigrayans who are against this narrative of Tigray genocide and against this attempt to overthrow the government there. And at one point, at some point we were like, we got to just go, because what happened was last, I believe, June, the Ethiopian government declared a unilateral ceasefire, basically handing the TPLF an opportunity to de-escalate the violence. And how did the TPLF respond? They responded by launching violent offensives into the neighboring states of Afar and Amhara. And that's where we went. We actually went to Amhara, where we went from we visited several towns that had been recently taken back by the government from the TPLF. And the people there just had one story of atrocity after the next. I mean, the TPLF just basically gang raped its way through these towns in an effort to make their way to Addis Ababa. They were trying to collapse the state and do as much damage as they could along the way. And it was horrifying. And I encourage people to go check out the packages that we've put out from Ethiopia, which you can find on the Breakthrough News YouTube page. We interviewed people in Lalibela, which is an UNESCO World Heritage Site for its very 100 years old churches that were built into the mountains there. And just one story of atrocity after the next. They destroyed the airport there for no reason other than to just screw the local economy that's dependent on tourism. We did a report on women we interviewed who were gang raped pretty systematically by the TPLF. It wasn't just an atrocity that happened during a war. It was a weapon of war. And you can see that from the stories that we were told that were full of, not just heart-wrenching and scary stories, but also the level of bigotry that they experienced while being gang raped, in many cases at gunpoint in front of their children. Anyways, so I encourage people to go check that out. But what we saw is a country that, Ethiopia is the second largest country in Africa. It has over 110 million people. And the US spent the last couple of years trying to tear it apart. And they didn't succeed. But as a result of the Ethiopian government, which was democratically elected twice, as a result of that government fighting back against a basically US-backed coup insurgency, they've been punished economically in many ways. And, we have reports on that as well. The US has been threatening them with sanctions. So far, they've only sanctioned Eritreans,
but the U.S. did remove Ethiopia from an Africa aid program, which is kind of a form of a sanction.
Yeah, which actually just hurts all these workers who mostly work at garment factories that are investments of China, but that do make American clothing for various American companies. And all of these women, we actually did. Eugene did a great package. Right when we got back, because the U.S. removed Ethiopia from the African Growth and Opportunity Act, known as AGOA for short, on January 1st. And this basically allows for allows the country to to be a base of making goods for cheap. And it creates all of these jobs that are mostly, by the way, held by women. So a lot of the women we spoke to, I'm not a fan of garment factories, but to be, if we're going to be honest here, a lot of the women we spoke to who worked at these places, it gave them a level of independence they didn't have before. And it also gave them an income, because a lot of them were from really rural, underdeveloped areas. And a lot of Ethiopia, well, it's a very rich country. is underdeveloped, like a lot of Africa. And so there's a lot of inequality. There's like places we went where people didn't have electricity or like weren't connected to an electricity network. They were like local farmers and like, herders. There's a big herding. A big part of the economy there is like herding cattle, basically. So this gave a lot of people an out and an opportunity where they could actually use their income to then go get educated, like go to college. And so these people, their livelihoods are now under threat because the U.S. is punishing Ethiopia by removing it from this trade agreement. In an effort to try to get them to stop fighting the TPLF, which, by the way, after they were pushed out of Amhara and Afar, they've now relaunched offensives into Afar, where they're doing the same stuff they've been doing. And everybody, like New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, are cheering this on, just like they did with the rebels in Syria, just like they do with the right-wing violence in Venezuela. And it's so absurd and ridiculous. And so I feel really lucky that we got to go there and see with our own eyes what was happening. And then, of course, we got to go to Eritrea as well.
Well, Rania, if I can cut you off for a second, I just want to say before we go to Eritrea, I want to point out a little historical fact back in the Obama administration. This is an article in the New York Times in 2015. Obama made this historic trip to Ethiopia when it was under the TPLF, which, as you said, very much was not a democracy.
No.
And this is the headline in the New York Times article. Obama in Ethiopia calls its government democratically elected. And here they note, Obama twice called the government of Ethiopia democratically elected as he stood by the country's prime minister. 2 months after elections handed every seat in parliament to the governing party and its allies. So, I mean, this, I think, really shows what the U.S. attitude was toward the TPLF regime in Ethiopia. Here's a photo of Obama with Susan Rice, the war hawk who was his national security advisor. So, I mean, the U.S. government definitely strongly supported the TPLF. And another point I just wanted to make really quickly, because, there are people on the left who I think rightfully maybe sometimes criticize and are a bit skeptical of Abiy. Abiy Ahmed, like we said, he's definitely not a socialist, and he's made these speeches talking about, capitalism, reform, and open up. But I think the main point is to understand the geopolitics and not just fixating on the internal economics. And when it comes to this, I'm reminded of this brilliant analysis that was recently published in this website, Brazil Wire, one of friends of the show, one of my favorite websites, the best English language resource on Brazil. And it's called Brazil, Kazakhstan, and the Grand Chessboard. It was published by this guy, or written by this guy, Marcelo Cerro, who is a political analyst for the Brazilian Workers' Party Senatorial Caucus. So he works with the left-wing Workers' Party of Brazil, which is the party of Lula da Silva. Mm-hmm. And he has a line in here that is so brilliant because he's talking about how, look, the Kazakhstan government, the Kazakh government certainly was not a socialist government, but, and actually it wasn't even it wasn't very critical of the West. It maintained good relations with the US and also with Russia and China. And this is the point that he made in this article, which I think very much applies to countries like Ethiopia, which they're not at the same level as countries like, Nicaragua and China and Venezuela, these socialist countries that have an anti-imperialist foreign policy. But there's these other countries that, as you pointed out from Eugene talking about how countries play a role, there's these countries that try to maintain an independent foreign policy that plays China and Russia against the West for what's best for them. And here he describes this policy, I think, really brilliantly. Again, this is an analyst from Brazil's Workers' Party. He says, everything indicates that for Washington, it is not enough for a government to have good relations with the U.S. It must also have a distant or even hostile relationship with Russia, China, Iran, and all other countries considered enemies by the State Department. It is a foreign policy strategy that bets on conflict and geopolitical exclusion. And Ethiopia is a really good example of this. So you actually, I want to get up you really quickly. You have this tweet here where you went to a park in Ethiopia that was built by China. And so, and again, Ethiopia is not some great socialist, anti-imperialist government, but it is an independent government that is collaborating very closely with China. China has turned and through this mutually beneficial program has turned Ethiopia into a significant part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And China is helping to build infrastructure in Ethiopia. Talk a little bit about that before you move to Eritrea.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you brought this up, because what's amazing about having visited Ethiopia, and so much has happened in the last couple of months. We've been to so many places. I actually forgot about this, and it's really important. But we got to go all around Addis Ababa, and one thing that was so clear is that China is building a lot there. They built this massive public library that is, I think, opening probably that just opened this month or is opening soon. Just huge, accessible, free to all, beautiful building that we got to go inside of. They also built these like big parks in parts of the city that prior to 2018 were basically like just underdeveloped areas where like there was maybe even like homeless people would go and like sleep. But now there are these really nice parks that are accessible to everybody to use. And it's like, it was really interesting because at the same time that we're seeing China aid is building this and building this, it really does speak to the difference between what China and the US are doing in the developing world. Because what is the US doing in Ethiopia right now? It's encouraging state collapse and a very destructive war and encouraging a regime change operation. Whereas China is just building stuff, and it's not even conditional. It's just to form a relationship with this country. That's why China does this, is to form a relationship. Obviously, they want some level of influence in terms of like having partners. It would be stupid for them not to be doing it to create good relationships with different countries and have some sort of positive impact from that. But the fact of the matter is that when you talk to people in these countries, that is what they see. That's the reality on the ground. The US is destructive, and China is actually building things and investing in their countries in ways that they can actually see, and that benefits their families. And this is why the US has to spend so much money, hundreds of millions of dollars, propagandizing against China across the developing world. They have to do that because the reality, like just to look at the reality, shows you something very different. And so we saw that very much on display in Ethiopia.
Yeah, and I just wanted to stress that point because I think it's clear that the Horn of Africa has become a major locus of conflict in the new Cold War. I mean, Africa in general, we've seen these coups backed by figures who are clearly more pro-American than they are pro-China. And in the case of Ethiopia, again, regardless of what people think about the policies of the Ethiopian government, which are not necessarily socialist, or they're not socialist at all. They're not necessarily left-wing either. But the reality is that this is an independent country that has a right to independence and sovereignty and self-determination. And it wants to have positive relations with China and Russia and Eritrea, its neighbor. And Washington only tolerates countries that cut off ties with China and Russia and Iran and Venezuela.
Exactly.
And so let's talk about the other.
Well, we are real quick. One last thing I will say about China real quick is also when China, just to what you're saying, when China was, or when we were in Ethiopia, the Chinese foreign minister had visited at some point while we were there, had visited the country and had actually made a statement that we do not intervene. And that's the other big difference between the Chinese and the US. Is despite forming these relationships, China isn't intervening in people's domestic politics. China isn't conditioning aid or investment on what form of, what kind of economy you have. Is it capitalist or socialist? Whereas with the US, you don't get any aid unless you have, or you're punished for having a socialist economy. You're punished for having anything independent or refusing to do what we want you to do. And you're told that you must do this domestically in order for us not to destroy you. So that's also like a huge difference between the Chinese and the US. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, and the ultimate irony of this is that it creates this political contradiction where even liberal governments like Abiy Ahmed, who gave speeches about how he's a capitalist and wants reforms and all this, even he is forced to take these positions that actually ally him with China and other countries if he wants to pursue an independent path of development, because imperialism tells countries in the global south that it's our way or the highway, that you have no other option. You're with us or against us.
The highway of death. It's like our way or the highway of death. Yeah.
Literally in the case of Iraq, right?
Yeah.
So even if you're not a socialist, if you want to have an independent path of development, you are forced into these positions that make you actually ally with progressive anti-imperialist forces. Russia's a good example of that. I mean, Russia certainly has a capitalist government. It's definitely not socialist, but Russia is one of the closest allies of Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. They actually just announced that they're partnering for military cooperation. So, I mean, the fact that the U.S. refuses to allow Russia to have an independent foreign policy and good relations actually, ironically, forces the capitalist government of Russia to ally with socialist governments in Latin America out of its own, self-interest. It's an interesting contradiction. And here's an image that you shared on Twitter that I think actually underscores this, where Ethiopia, a few years ago, Abiy Ahmed was giving speeches about how he wanted to improve relations with the West and all of this. And then they stabbed him in the back and they tried to organize this regime change operation against him. And what that actually did is it turned a lot of liberal Ethiopians to the left in a way, or at least made them more nationalist and anti-imperialist. And now you have, as you tweeted out this political cartoon in the Ethiopian Herald newspaper, you now have these regular representations of anti-American sentiment, of people,
which you never had before in Ethiopia. Like Ethiopians were very pro-American, and the US did a huge disservice to itself by taking this otherwise pro-American country and putting it almost in like the anti-imperialist camp. Like, it's actually kind of incredible. Yeah.
I mean, it does remind me to an extent of Hugo Chavez. I mean, when Hugo Chavez won the first election in Venezuela in 1998, he was running as the fifth Republican movement. He was running as a left-wing nationalist, but he never talked about socialism. In fact, he gave speeches about how we have to move beyond capitalism and socialism and find a new way and all this stuff. I mean, he was a progressive, but he was not a socialist. And it wasn't until the 2002 coup backed by the US against him that he began radicalizing and moving to the left. And then he declared socialism in the 21st century. So the point is that when imperialism attacks countries, it actually sometimes strengthens progressive forces of resistance. And I think Ethiopia is an interesting case of this. And Eritrea is also certainly a case of this. So let's talk about the other very important strategic player. You mentioned Somalia.
I do. I have like 10 minutes before I have to run. So I will try to do this as briefly as possible, which seems really unfair to Eritrea. But I will say, if you keep your eye on Breakthrough News' YouTube page, we do have our, we actually haven't put out anything on Eritrea yet. That is coming, I believe, next week, if I'm not mistaken. So keep your eye out there. We'll have like a much more in-depth look at Eritrea. But Eritrea, I felt really lucky to go there because a lot of people don't get to go to Eritrea. It's quite to the United States, which has been sanctioning Eritrea since, I believe, like the 90s, if I'm not mistaken, but particularly the last 20 years. All we ever actually know about Eritrea or ever hear, I mean, I think if you go to YouTube and you put in Eritrea, one of the first things that comes up is like a Vice. You can already see where this is going. It's like a mini Vice documentary, and the title is something like Eritrea, the North Korea of Africa. Like, which of course, North Korea is another country that is so demonized.
North Korea is not even the North Korea of North Korea.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. But, Eritrea is a really interesting country because, like you mentioned with Cuba, how like a lot of times in the global North, you'll see American officials or European officials taking these developing countries that they've like looted and destroyed through colonialism and imperialism and trying to compare them to the rich global North. It's only rich because it looted and destroyed those places, instead of comparing them to their neighbors. And in the case of Africa, Eritrea has some of the best social indicators on the African continent, particularly when compared to countries that are the greatest allies of the US. So like child mortality is lower. People live to a much older age. And part of that is because of Eritrea's development model, which is, I believe, why it's so targeted. And not only does Eritrea refuse to submit to American imperial dictates, and that's why it's punished, but moreover, Eritrea, has a lot of socialist attributes that make it a place that could present a really good economic alternative to what has happened to a lot of the rest of Africa in terms of taking their cues from what the US demands they do, having capitalist economies with like an oligarchic elite that hoard all the resources while the vast majority of people live in like destitute poverty, which is like how Nigeria is, for example, a very close ally of the US. Eritrea, on the other hand, has a very self-sufficient model that offers free medical care. That, you know, we've got to visit like a hospital in Eritrea that reminded me a lot of Cuba. The system didn't seem quite as developed as Cuba, but it did offer that same kind of holistic, free medical care, or medical care so cheap it might as well be free, kind of system that focused on prevention, which they have to focus on prevention because they don't have access to all the goods or equipment that they need to deal with like the sort of illnesses that you end up with in the US from not taking care of people throughout their lives. And, you know, Eritrea is always called, oh, it's like so anti-democratic and terrible. But like, again, compare it to its neighbors. A lot of African countries that the US is best friends with don't have democratic systems, including the TPLF-led system in Ethiopia that you just showed everybody Obama went to and praised as democratic back in 2015.
Well, and also when countries are not able to develop freely, when they're put under siege, you can't expect them to be beacons of Jeffersonian democracy, as if that's like actual democracy anyway.
Yeah,
I mean, that's fake democracy.
It is fake democracy because you know what the other thing about Eritrea that I found really interesting is like I was expecting to go to somewhere that was like a police state where the police were just everywhere and watching you, but that wasn't at all the case. I don't think, again, I think I might have seen like one police car the whole time I was there. It actually felt, again, like a very warm place. It helped. The weather was nice, but like the people were really warm. The people were quite educated. And one thing that was really interesting there that was so different from Ethiopia is the countryside was really developed. I'm not saying it was rich because like everybody in Eritrea, you know, it's a poor country that's under sanction. So, but people have their basic needs, and the countryside was not nearly as underdeveloped and impoverished as the countryside that I saw in Ethiopia. And Eritrea really focuses on investing in the countryside over the cities. Because people, you need farmers, you know, as much as in the global north, we've been taught that like farming is gross and weird and being a farmer is just like hard labor that's not important. It's actually the most important labor, and that needs to be invested in. And people, like, it's actually crazy. Like,
I mean, if you can't eat, you die. It should be obvious.
We're just like, oh, we just want to be able to like go to grocery stores and live in cities, which is actually like super unsustainable. And like,
that food just comes out of nowhere. Just like you just pick it off a tree. It just grows like,
it just grows like that. And nobody has to do anything. So they invest a lot in the countryside, and they invest a lot in dams so that the countryside has access to like the farming materials required to do agricultural production. And they focus a lot on self-sufficiency, unlike a lot of the rest of Africa, where like the US dumps its like wheat and grain, which they're forced to accept, that ruins their local industries. And they become like dependent on humanitarian aid from these various international organizations. Eritrea is very big on being self-sufficient and being able to feed itself and clothe itself. And it works.
Sorry to cut you off again, but Eritrea also kicked out USAID and does not allow groups to accept money from the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy. And Eritrea, along with Zimbabwe, are the only countries in Africa that do not work with AFRICOM.
Right. That's one reason why Eritrea is punished as well, because the U.S. is actually ramping up the size of AFRICOM, particularly in the Horn of Africa, which is a very geostrategically important place. So for imperialism. But so, I mean, it was Eritrea, though, it was really incredible too, because like, you know, I think that the way we think about democracy, I'm not saying Eritrea is democratic, but there's different ways to look at what democracy can mean. And there's things that I saw there that I thought were really interesting. Like when it comes to making new like laws or changes to the judicial system, there is like heavy involvement in that process by people who are involved in like law, like the judges and lawyers. Like, but when we were there, we had come like a week after they had this law week where they debated all of the problems and reforms that people want to make to the judicial system. And I thought that was really interesting because we don't do that in the US. And just, you know, not to be so Cuba dominant, but something I forgot to mention that I thought was so fascinating in Cuba, which I actually would argue is more democratic than the US in so many ways, is Cuba is currently in the process of, well, they're about to start a debate in parliament about changing their family code. And the family code basically governs like marriage, what happens if you get divorced, what happens with inheritance. the rights of children, same-sex couples and whether they can adopt, the rights of women. And Cuba is like, for the past several months before Parliament's about to debate this, Cuba has had a system where every single workplace has been debating the family code and what they want and don't want. And government people go and collect information from those debates happening in the workplace to then take those up to the commissions, to then take those up to the parliament to debate. So it's a system where you have the country, like a lot of people, regular people across the country, in their neighborhoods even, involved in having a voice in the changes to a law that affects everybody, or a code that affects everybody. And I think about that, and they're going to and then starting in February, they're going to spend the next 3 months debating this in Parliament to institute the reforms that people in their workplaces, the majority of people, wanted. And what I think is so incredible about this is I look at the US. When is the last time any of us had any say in any specific law? Like
never.
And at any level, like our laws are literally just written by like pharmaceutical executives and weapons industry executives, and are the people that we vote to power in Congress, the pre-approved candidates that were given to vote for in Congress, in the Senate and the House of Representatives, don't even read the bills half the time. Like,
yeah, and I want to point out that it's not hyperbole. There are so many reports of these cases where like big lobbyists like ALEC and all these groups, they literally write legislation because we've had like leaks of like the Word documents, like the files on Microsoft Word, and it shows the author, and the author computer is like one of these big lobbyist firms that are hired by big corporations to literally write legislation in the US.
Exactly. That's like how our process works. Like we actually, there was a study, I don't remember what school did it, so I'm sorry for like not knowing where to point people, but if you look up like who has power in the US over like legislation, it turns out that average Americans have zero power. And that's reflected.
Yeah, it was a study that was done by a Princeton Princeton researcher, which is like, I mean, if you're interested in like bourgeois academia, that's as scholarly as it gets.
Yeah, exactly. So the Princeton researcher, right there it is.
Here's Vox saying why it's wrong. Vox, which is funded by Walmart, the sponsored content for Walmart.
Oh my God.
Here's BBC study. U.S. is an oligarchy, not a democracy. I mean, so is Britain, by the way, but
right.
Yeah,
but I mean, even Britain has a little bit more representation than the U.S. does because they have a parliamentary system. But yeah, they're also an oligarchy. But I think
here's the study.
What were the like numbers? The numbers were crazy. It was something like I don't know. I can't remember. It was like 60% of, I don't know. I don't remember what the numbers were, and maybe you'll find them as I'm talking about this. But like,
here we go. A proposed policy change with low support among economically elite Americans is adopted only 18% of the time, while a proposed change with high support is adopted 45% of the time. So, I mean, rich people, if they don't like a law, it's not adopted. If they do like it, it probably will be adopted.
That is why we don't have free college or free healthcare. The majority of Americans want those things. We don't have them because we're not a democracy. And if we were a democracy, we would. So like, anyways, I know that I'm going on a total tangent from Eritrea, but
no, but it's not a tangent. I mean, because the U.S. is punishing Eritrea, and not just the U.S., the European Union. Many countries have imposed sanctions on Eritrea for not adopting that system that they call democratic.
Yeah.
That's why it's being punished.
And under the auspices of like human rights violations and democracy. And anyways, I mean, I think Eritrea was a really interesting place. I'd love to be able to go back there and spend more time there. I'm excited for our reporting about Eritrea to come out. And, you know, I really do believe like after visiting there, because, you know, before I started, like even I didn't really know that much about the Horn of Africa, I'll admit, before the last year, because it's not really I know I spend a lot of time in the Middle East. And that's kind of my area of like understanding for like world affairs. But I'm so glad that I've gotten to visit these places and learn about them, because one thing that it really taught me is like, there are places the US has demonized to such a strong degree that even I, like a few years ago, I thought Eritrea was just this terrible place, because that's what everyone says. It's a terrible place that everyone's fleeing all the time, right? There's Eritreans like fleeing into Israel and to Sudan and to all these places. And you just can't trust these depictions. It's not to say these places are perfect or great or wonderful or don't be critical. It's just, you know, when we're being told to dehumanize people to the point where it's just this black hole of nothingness that we don't really know anything about it, you have to question why. And I want to add one more thing about the Horn of Africa. You know, the US is also right now involved in a campaign to try to destroy leaders that they don't like in Somalia. Like, one of the things that Abiy Ahmed did that I think the US was so threatened by was make peace with Eritrea, have this relationship with Farmajo in Somalia, and it kind of have this idea of a broader Horn of Africa cooperation where all these countries like work together as a region. And there's nothing the US fears more than any sort of level of independence regionally, whether it's the Horn of Africa, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's different regions of Latin America. This is like, and like this is this sort of economic cooperation and independence regionally terrifies US imperialism, because imperialism is all about dividing and conquering and making sure everybody's stuck in their own little places because you can control them easier that way. That's why the US is so supportive of the sort of ethnic-based system that the TPLF set up in Ethiopia, because it keeps people divided. That's why the US is so supportive of sectarianism in the Middle East, because it keeps people divided. That's why the US is so supportive of these right-wing movements that divide across Latin America, because it keeps people divided, and on and on and on and on. And so people really need to start thinking about the things in that context. Well, they already are, I think, but like especially understanding the Horn of Africa in that context, because, you know, the Horn of Africa has often been neglected in sort of our analysis of things because Africa is just kind of neglected. But this region, especially as this Cold War with China kicks off and becomes even more intense, is going to become a bigger playground for the US as that war intensifies.
Yeah, and I'm just going to get up a map really quickly showing the Horn of Africa region, just so people understand just at a geographic level how incredibly strategic this region is. And, you know, it connects West Asia to Africa, and you have the Gulf of Aden going into the Red Sea. So there's a bunch of trade that goes through here. Here on the map, you can see this area called the Bab al-Mandab, which connects Yemen to Djibouti, and here, and also Eritrea and Ethiopia are right there as well. And here, every single day, there are millions of barrels of oil that go through the Bab al-Mandab. And that's one of the reasons there's been so much fighting in Yemen. The war is still going on in Yemen right now. It's not a coincidence that Yemen is right across, just across the ocean right there from Ethiopia, Eritrea, and also Djibouti. Djibouti has many foreign military bases. Many countries have military bases in Djibouti. It's because it's such a geostrategic hub for commerce, for politics, and of course for the military. So I agree, this region, the Horn of Africa, is very important geostrategically, and I think in the years to come, it's going to become even more important, especially as the US tries to prevent the further rise of China. China has good relations with the countries in the Horn of Africa and across the African continent, which is why there's so much propaganda about China's development projects in Africa. So on that note, I know that you have to go, Rania. So I just want to thank you for joining us.
Can I just give one little plug?
Yeah.
Since you've got people on this live stream, don't miss out on our Thursday afternoon, 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. Breakthrough News Freedom Side live stream hosted by me and Eugene Puryear, also on YouTube. Just throwing that out there for those who are watching.
Yeah, definitely. I would highly recommend everyone watching. Hopefully you already all are subscribers to Breakthrough News. If not, go over to Breakthrough News after subscribing here if you're not subscribed to Multipolarista. So Rania, other than, people can follow you on Twitter at Rania Khalek, and they can follow your work at Breakthrough News. Is there anything else you wanted to plug before wrapping up?
Breakthrough News, .org. We have a website as well. You can follow all of our other content, ends up there as well. And you can follow my website, raniakhalek.com, where I actually post all the videos you'll see on YouTube anyways. And then I got to shout out Eugene Puryear's amazing podcast, The Punch Out, which is like just like a very short, like 15 minutes of the most important things you need to know for the day, from the day of the news from a left perspective. And actually that's like a huge resource for me, especially when I'm outside of the country. But Ben, I just want to say I'm like so excited for you for this new outlet. I know that you're already producing amazing content, and I'm so excited for what's to come. And we're all just very proud of you.
Thank you, Rania. Mutual admiration. I'm always admiring what you all do at Breakthrough News. And I want to thank everyone who joined us in the chat. This was a good, successful live stream. Thanks to I know there was a pretty fervent debate going on in the chat. So it
was there?
yeah, about a lot of different things. So
Ah.
I mean, it's good to see people, talking. And I want to thank everyone, especially the super chat comments. Thanks to Kyle Wool. Thanks to None OYB. Thanks to all of the supporters and anyone who wants to support this show. You can go to patreon.com/multipolarista. I'm going to put that in the comments below. And then, of course, you can also go and support Breakthrough News. The last thing I'll say here, I guess, is this super chat comment from Red Pill. Love, peace, freedom, happiness, and Antifa anti-fascist. Cool. I can. That's the message we'll leave with today. Love, peace, freedom, happiness, and anti-fascism. That sounds pretty good to me. See you all next time.